The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it.
The insistence by President Donald Trump that the US should take control of Gaza and displace its population breaks decades of American policy and has the potential to upend the Middle East. This at a critical time, as the Israel-Hamas ceasefire hangs in the balance, and desperate families await the return of dozens of hostages from the Strip. For Palestinians in Gaza, the threat of another violent, forced displacement is a terrifying prospect. It would also constitute a breach of international law. So what comes next for the Palestinians? And what are the broader consequences for the region? Today, I am joined by Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, and Jørgen Jensehaugen, senior researcher at PRIO and a specialist in the Arab-Israeli conflict. I am Arnaud Siad, and you're listening to PRIO's Peace in a Pod. Francesca, Jørgen, welcome to this episode. Francesca, I have to start by asking you about President Trump as saying, I'm committed to buying and owning Gaza, saying he wants to turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. I mean, this is extraordinary and unprecedented. He believes almost all Gazans should leave the Strip, and under his plans, Palestinians wouldn't have the right to return. You are the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. So what do you say to Trump's plans?
I think it's absurd and so grotesque that we should not forget to smile at it. I mean, it's really ridiculous and it's outrageous that someone in a position of power does it. And we should not panic. This is a sign that we need to change something. And this is what matters the most to me. This statement incorporates so many international crimes, so is declaring basic his intention to occupy the Gaza Strip, or to occupy on top of the Israeli occupation, to forcibly displace, dispossess, to act for deportation plan. It makes no sense whatsoever, let alone the context of a genocide. So this is this should be a wake-up call without people frantically running around like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Get your acts together and rediscover your principles, because we are in a time of crisis and we need to act according to the rules.
I just really want to add to that, because, I mean, the whole concept behind the MAGA, behind Trump's ideology is, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. But one of them is really to reduce the American global footprint. I mean, this national protection kind of approach, whilst this is really the opposite. I mean, within this approach, there is ethnic cleansing really as part of that. And in order to do that, you need boots on the ground. In order to reconstruct Gaza, you need tons of money. And that's the kind of footprint that Trump really ran against doing. So I don't think we should see the realism in Trump saying this. What really concerns me is kind of the knock-on effect on Israeli politics, because if we think of Israeli politics as kind of like a spectrum from security-oriented thinking towards ideological tinted ethnic cleansing, settling Gaza with Israeli settlers, this really green lights the latter approach. And that's what really concerns me, that kind of in the context of the ceasefire and all of this, it green lights the far right in Israel.
May I add, I really like your analysis. It makes a lot of sense, but also it's true that the US look at this policy in connection with the other things that the executive orders that this administration is passing, like cutting US aid everywhere but Israel. The boots on the grounds are already there, are the Israelis. So he's creating the political space and probably also twisting the resources around this, cementing this colonization in the little that remains of Palestine as part of American imperialism.
But if we take a step back, does that mean that the forced displacement of Palestinians, a crime under international law, is now official US policy?
as stated, that's it, right? So there's no way to reconstruct Gaza the way Trump highlights without ethnic cleansing. And he's very clear about it. I mean, he says they are not returning, they don't have the right to return, and they have to be expelled in order for this to happen, right? It's he calls it like a construction site, and there can't be people in the way when you have a construction site. I mean, it's very, very explicit. And once again, like I'm not concerned that he will enact that policy, but he greenlights a policy that a huge chunk of the Israeli leadership supports, right? Mm-hmm. And so there is this internal power struggle in Israel between those who explicitly push for depopulation, push for ethnic cleansing and Israeli repopulation of Gaza, and the others who kind of want to have a, bigger buffer zone, cut the strip in half, more security. And he's really laying heavy weight on the first camp. And that's, for me, what's really problematic here.
And I really like the way you put it, and I think that I will use it myself. The deportation and the first displacement, ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians with the statements becomes official U.S. foreign policy. And I would like people to link the dots, and this is why it's important to have in mind the settler colonial framework. Imagine how other indigenous people have been treated as disposable. You have a construction project, a development project, and you push indigenous people out no matter what their rights are. I mean, this has happened in so many countries, particularly in the global south, but not only. And at the same time here there is something different. This is the US talking of a people who have been already displaced for decades by Israel, which is the US protege. So it's unveiling, it's unmasking a reality which was there, but now it's to be brutally seen in its nudity, in its nakedness. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Francesca, I want to ask you about the issue of genocide. The Ministry of Health in Gaza, run by Hamas, says over 48,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 2023. The Lancet, a world-leading medical journal, said that this is likely an underestimation and that the true figures are probably 40% higher. We're talking staggering numbers here. Francesca, you've said that in Gaza, we went from a risk of genocide to a high risk of genocide, and now a genocide is taking place. To all listeners, can you tell us what was the tipping point when this became, in your assessment and that of many other lawyers, a genocide, and why this fits the threshold?
Genocide is the intention to destroy a group, a racial, ethnic, religious, or national as such, and it gets done through this is Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, so acts of killing members of the group, inflicting severe bodily or mental harm, creating conditions of life that would lead to the destruction of the group, or transferring children and preventing birth. So you see, genocide is a very composite crime. Even one of these acts, it's enough to have genocide. So you can have genocide without killing anyone, just by transferring children, by cutting the bloodlines. The critical points are two. First of all, aiming through this act to destroy the group as such. So the individuals do not matter, it's the group. Whomever is a member of the group is targetable. In this case, whomever is a Palestinian becomes a threat, therefore killable, destroyable, torturable, etc. And then, in order to prove genocide, you need to demonstrate the intent that behind these acts, there is the intent to destroy. And I don't think that in this case, there is anything that is more visible than the intent of Israeli politicians, many of the Israeli soldiers on the ground, intent to annihilate the people, not the individuals, not Hamas. And again, it resonates strongly. I continue to read what is on social media and what comes out of big celebrities or media people in Israel. And it's shocking because they do not see the people in Gaza or the Palestinians in general as human. And you can see it has happened in the Gaza Strip, continues to happen, but also it's expanding dangerously to the West Bank. And the last point is that genocide is a crime that we, under the Genocide Convention, are obliged to three things: prevent, stop, punish. So we cannot prevent something if we do not see it. And this is the problem, that by continuing to deny that the genocide is happening, member states feel they do not have to intervene. But the ICJ provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice on the 26th of January 2024 are that alarm that should have triggered a reaction by member states. This was the sign that there was a risk of genocide. And not many states, the majority of states, have ignored that wake-up call.
And actually, a question I have for the both of you. I mean, Jørgen, starting with you, we have the case brought by South Africa to the International Court of Justice, and we also have countries like Brazil, Colombia, and others who are accusing Israel of committing a genocide. But Western countries, in particular in Europe, North America, have resisted calling it a genocide. Why is that?
I think it's breaks down to two things in a sense. So one thing is the politics of it. It's a very hard accusation, and I think in general it would be true, but also in a specifically difficult moment where we don't want to upend our relation with the U.S. in a situation where the U.S. is unstable, to put it mildly, but also extremely pro-Israel in this moment. The other part, I think, comes to how we think about the institutions of law. And genocide is this very peculiar kind of accusation or crime because it is the most severe crime. I mean, we can talk about hierarchies of crime, but really it is the most severe crime, the way we typically think about it, which also means that the burden of proof is the highest. And for me, this creates a real paradox because you spend so much time proving it while it's happening that by the time you come to the conclusion that it is happening, you've allowed it to happen for such a long time. And that's really what we see in the ICJ. We don't know how the ICJ will conclude, but let's say they conclude it is genocide. Because of the burden of proof demanded, it will have taken such a long time of allowing it to happen until you reach the proof. And this is really, really difficult.
That's all right. That's all right. But at the same time, this is the thing. There are two cases for genocide pending before the ICJ. If there were no risk of genocide, the court would have not even opened the case. Not only that, it would have said, it would have rejected it. It would have said no. Instead, it's continuing. It has recognized the plausibility of the risk of genocide based on the evidence that the South African state submitted in December 2023, and it has issued provisional measures. And it has even this is the thing, it has named Israeli leaders whom had been identified for incitement to genocide, which is already a crime. You see, so what should have happened on top of what member states should have done, and they have not, is the Israeli judiciary should have opened an investigation over those who had been named by the court, by the president of the court, and for incitement. And this has not happened. So impunity has continued to reign inside Israel and outside, I'm afraid.
I just also want to add one thing there when it comes to Israel's responsibility in these provisional measures. So one of the things they were asked to do was explicitly you have to allow more aid in. And if you look at UNRWA's reports on how many aid trucks go in, they actually went down right after that provisional measure. So basically, Israel's reaction has been not only do we deny that this is taking place, but we actually contravene the orders we get from the ICJ because there is such a lack of respect for the institution, a disdain for it. And we see this pattern both from the US and from Israel, where they're really willing to burn this institution down to defend their own position. And this means that what's happening in Gaza is, of course, primarily dangerous for what's happening in Gaza. But it also has this very, very dangerous knock-on effects for conflicts all over the world because these institutions are being destroyed in order to defend what Israel is doing in Gaza.
And as we talk about institutions, and Francesca, you said impunity. That's the word you used. And last December, you called for Israel to have its UN credentials suspended. To date, I believe no member state has ever been formally suspended or expelled from the UN entirely, although some states, like apartheid South Africa back in the day, were suspended from the General Assembly itself or other UN bodies. Francesca, can you tell us why you're making that call, and are there mechanisms that could make what you're asking for a possibility?
Look, the thing is that let alone the crimes that have been committed against the Palestinians, there is, what Jørgen says, a total disrespect coming from Israel and supported by the United States toward the institution. They're part of the United Nations. I mean, in 1 year, Israel has targeted and severely damaged and even destroyed, in some cases, 70% of the UN premises in the Gaza Strip. It has killed over 240 UN staff members. It has injured UN beneficiaries as they were seeking shelter in UN premises. I mean, I've met kids who had been severely injured. I mean, really, one with a stomach open because of these bombs. And she said, I was in an UNRWA school as she was hit. And also they have been attacking UN peacekeepers in Lebanon. They've been declaring persona non grata so many in the UN, including the UN Secretary General, let alone myself. Think of the spurious attacks against the UN as a cloak of anti-Semites, supporting terrorists. You know, there is some decorum. There are rules in how to run the General Assembly, and having the Israeli ambassador shredding, really turning into pieces, the UN Charter in front of all the other members of the UN, saying, oh, you are shredding the UN Charter. I mean, this epitomizes where we are. The Israel crushes international law and then accuses others to do that, not to respect basic rules of the Israelis. So it's really farcical. It would make people laugh. If it were not so tragic. This is why eventually I said, it's time for the UN to protect itself. And by the way, I have not mentioned, last but not least, Israel de facto outlawed a UN agency from operating in the occupied Palestinian territory over which, including East Jerusalem, which is occupied, over which Israel has no sovereignty. This is extremely serious and deserves a reaction. This is why I said, Israel should be suspended. It shouldn't have its voting rights in the General Assembly, to say the least. Yes, I mean, there are procedures. My fear is that, of course, there will be a U.S. opposition. U.S. has a veto in the Security Council, but we need to have this discussion. And it has started because there are member states like Malaysia who are leading toward that.
But this would need to go through the UN Security Council.
I don't remember in the case of South Africa. I think so.
Okay.
So, yeah, I just wanted to add, I think, an important part about the UN and Israel. Because Israel makes a lot of noise about the UN being unfavorable to them. And to a certain extent, that's true, but it's also based on a very false premise. So it's true in the sense that, yes, there are more resolutions against them in the General Assembly than against a lot of other bad actors. The Human Rights Commission often targets Israel. They definitely don't like UNRWA. But actually, if you look at the power structures of the UN is really tilted in Israel's favor, because the power in the UN rests in the Security Council, and there Israel is protected by the US veto. So it's this very interesting game where they, on the one hand, can say, oh, look, this whole body is against us. And then on the other hand, they can put all their trust in that body because they're protected there.
And this is the thing, more than exactly to avoid that. So the power of in the UN still rests with the Security Council. So yes, well, the Security Council ultimately decides on membership. The Security Council decides on so many things, but in the past there have been cases of impasse because of the veto power of one or the other. And in the past, like in the case of Korea, for example, the UN, but other cases, the UN as the General Assembly, which is a more democratic, veto-less reality assembly, has used uniting for peace resolution, so to take decisions that would circumvent the use of the veto power. And this is what I'm advocating for, that the decision power should be in the hands of the members of the General Assembly. However, what I want to highlight is also that the member states have power on their own. It's not that they have ceded sovereignty to the General Assembly. The General Assembly is a space, is a forum, to take decisions together, to discuss, to use diplomacy, and to determine politics according to international law. But eventually, it's their choice, and they have individually obligations under international law. And it's never too late to do the right things. And look at the Hague Group, for example. Every member state, they have obligations under international law, said they should comply with it, and still they don't. So, and there are challenges. So a number of member states, 9 states, have gathered in the Hague Group to say, as of today, we will do 3 things together: no harbor, no weapons to Israel, and accountability. So investigation and prosecutions of people who have committed crimes.
I want to turn to the West Bank, and the situation there has been escalating recently. It seems as if Israel's firepower is now shifting towards the West Bank, and the Israeli military has been expanding Operation Iron Wall in different refugee camps there, with tens of thousands of refugees forcibly displaced, and Israel claims it is trying to dismantle terrorist groups there. But we also know that the Trump administration has lifted Biden-era sanction that had been set against some very violent Israeli settlers. Jørgen, is the West Bank the next Gaza?
So, Jørgen, before you speak, just for the record and for those who are listening, we shouldn't project that all of a sudden the West Bank has been hit by rising violence, because the West Bank was already very violent before October 7 and has continued to be violent after October 7. In fact, between October 7, 2023 and October 2024, 830 Palestinians have been killed, including 170 children in the West Bank alone. So it was, and before October 7, during the period I've been a special rapporteur, May 2022, October 2023, 460 Palestinians had been killed, mostly in the West Bank. So the situation was very violent already.
I mean, last time I was in the West Bank was in September 2023, and we really got a sense that that's where things would happen, because things were so extremely tense there. I mean, things were happening there, but in terms of like an even greater escalation. The West Bank is much more ideologically part of the far right in Israel than Gaza is. So I just kind of want to start my answer by reflecting over the name of the operation, the Iron Wall, because this is really important to actually put this in context. The Iron Wall is kind of the core of Israeli right-wing politics. It's Jabotinsky, who was the founding father of Israeli or Zionist revisionism. And it's basically this ideology that says we have to erect an iron wall so the natives don't dare oppose us. It's a very militaristic approach to what he was very clear about was colonizing territory. And I kind of want to use this as a frame, because what's happening in the West Bank is 2 things at once, and basically they play on each other. So one thing is what is Israeli security concerns, right? So Palestinians have been fragmented into smaller military groups in kind of a vacuum after the Palestinian Authority has really become absent in many parts of Palestinian political fabric. And on the other hand, there is a far right-wing ideology in Israel that really wants to push out Palestinians, annex the area, build more settlements. And these 2, call them concerns or call them camps or whatever, they really affect each other. So in a sense, let's say you have a real security threat, a terrorist attack, whatnot. This gives an excuse to the army or a real reason for the army to intervene. But that happens in a context of far-right ideology pushing for annexation, pushing for settlement, pushing for expulsion of Palestinians. And these feed on each other. So the army will go in, packed with this ideology, supporting settlers. Settlers at the same time will enact violence on their own against Palestinian society. The Israeli army will protect them. The anger this causes with Palestinians will then create an excuse for the Israeli army to do more, which creates a leeway for the settlers to do more. So it's really this kind of feeding of each other that are packed together. So if you only look at the security aspect and ignore the ideological aspect, you're missing a huge part of the picture. If you only think about this ideologically, you're missing the part that even kind of mainstream within Israel accept what the army is doing because they think about this in terms of security. So it's really this kind of feedback going on.
Yeah, I really like the way you frame things because they are very, very clear. And there is another element that has become more and more evident as of December 2024. It was evident to people like me for absence of action, and this is now evident because of action. And it's just the fact that Palestinians lack protection from all sides. I mean, in our part of the world, in Europe, people really think of the Palestinians and the Israelis having two states. And there is the Palestinian Authority, so the Palestinians have the Palestinian Authority. But look at what the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian security forces in the face of what Jørgen is describing are doing. In 2023, from January, all over the year, there have been attacks on Palestinian villages with houses and cars being attacked, incinerated, and people beaten and assaulted by mobs of settlers in the West Bank, of course, supported by the soldiers. And the settlers and the soldiers are the same. They act in tandem. Often they are the same people. Now, in the Palestinian Authority, there have been 12 pogroms, as Israeli organizations have described it, from these Israeli mobs toward the Palestinians. Have you ever seen the Palestinian security forces intervening to protect the Palestinians? The answer is no. And at the same time, because of the situation, let's go back to the situation that Jørgen was describing. So the Israeli army and the settlers attacking the Palestinians reacting. Doesn't matter how they have been fragmented, but of course you oppress the population revolt and resist. And this is when as of December 5th, the Palestinian security forces have kicked in and they've even started arresting, shooting at, and even killing Palestinians. Even a Palestinian journalist has been killed by the Palestinian security forces. The Palestinian Authority has outlawed Al Jazeera, has banned Al Jazeera from operating. Why? I would like people who listen to us, they need to understand that the Palestinian Authority, as per the agreements that tragically have the name of your capital, the Oslo Accords. Under the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians have no protection because the Palestinian security forces are there to help the Israelis ensure their security, which is tragic and paradoxical.
I want to ask about UNRWA, which you both mentioned earlier, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, which delivers, critical aid, food, the most basic of services to the people in Gaza and Palestinians in the region. And it's now banned from operating in the occupied territory by Israel. Jørgen, how is that ban on UNRWA being enforced on the ground? And can you also tell us what is happening to other humanitarian and peacekeeping forces in the immediate region, like UNIFIL in Lebanon?
So we just published a policy brief on UNRWA and trying to understand how this is going to affect things. So in our estimation, it will happen differently in 3 different geographical areas. And as we've talked about already, East Jerusalem is part of occupied West Bank. But by Israeli law, not by international law, by Israeli law, it's part of sovereign Israeli territory. And so according to the Israeli law, things apply differently in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in Gaza. Gaza and the West Bank are technically, the same law applies, but because the contexts are so different in terms of how Israel acts there and the situation on the ground, the law will apply differently. Now, the law came into effect on the 30th of January. So far, it's been more or less a game of chicken, in the sense that what has happened very concretely is that the UN field office in East Jerusalem has been not physically taken over, but UNRWA has been kicked out. So there we expect that to become an Israeli settlement unless somebody seriously intervenes and makes sure that that's a step too far. But what's kind of just hanging in like a limbo where we're expecting something to happen, but it hasn't happened yet, is that we expect the UNRWA schools in East Jerusalem to be taken over, or the kids to be moved to Israeli schools. We expect humanitarian aid to become extremely difficult in Gaza, because it's important to remember that UNRWA, even though it itself has a relatively low percentage of the aid, it's 15% officially. But if you break those numbers down, it's more like 80%. Because what they do is that they provide the logistics for all the other agencies. They provide so-called deconfliction with COGAT, with the Israeli military control of the area. They import actually more aid than is stamped UNRWA, because Israel really has been against UNRWA for such a long time that they purchase World Food Program aid, and then they import it to Gaza, and then they distribute it as UNRWA aid. So the numbers are, it's really hard to get a hold of. So that's short term. I mean, the aid operation might technically collapse even as more aid is coming in due to the ceasefire. But more long term, probably the most important thing UNRWA does is schools and healthcare. In Gaza, there's been a situation of scholasticide, right? The school system has been virtually eradicated. So when the war ends, and it must end one day, rebuilding the school system without UNRWA is going to be extremely difficult. And in the West Bank, there is the potential that kind of the knock-on effects of this law means that the UNRWA schools will have to close. If that happens, we're talking 96 schools. The Palestinian Authority's ability to take that into their kind of portfolio is, first of all, they're against it politically, because that would mean that they would see that as cutting off kind of the Palestinian right of return. But secondly, they don't have the political credibility nor the finances to do that. And are donors going to step in to do that? Big question, and very doubtful. So there's actually a potential for a domino effect where if UNRWA collapses, the Palestinian Authority collapses. So it has these huge ramifications. But right now we're in this kind of very, very tense moment of what I describe as a game of chicken, right? Or a sword of Damocles, where there is this kind of impending catastrophe, but we don't know exactly when it will hit.
May I comment on this? First of all, I would like to remind everyone of what is UNRWA. UNRWA has cornered itself into this role of the humanitarian agencies, providing food parcels and health, which, by the way, was pathetically low anyway. It's not the quality of the services that UNRWA provide that makes a difference, other than education probably, and it has gone down over time because of the lack of resources. So UNRWA is not what it used to be like in the 60s, for example. And I say UNRWA has, and I've expressed this criticism before, has been a very poor advocate of itself, because the mandate that UNRWA has under UN, their international law and UN law is much broader, because UNRWA is part of the UN protection system that was devised in the late 40s for Palestinian refugees, with including the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, responsible for mostly the political solution of what was the Arab-Israeli conflict, including the Palestinian refugees. And UNRWA was and also some of the rights of the Palestinians, most of the political rights of the Palestinians, like return or other forms of durable solutions, taking care of their property the property rights of the Palestinians. But UNRWA was a complement to it, was ancillary to it. UNCCP, this primary body, has been put into a coma by the General Assembly, and UNRWA has remained. But again, I want to say that the mandate for protection of the Palestinians that has been devised is there. So I would have expected UNRWA over time, as it has started to do at some point in history, to continue to serve in its entirety that UN protection mandate, as for example UNHCR has done. Think of stateless persons inside a country. There is nothing more counterintuitive that UNHCR, which is the agency mandated to protect people the moment they cross a border and they seek protection, than UNHCR starting to protect people displaced within national borders where they still have the state's responsibility. Why UNHCR has stepped up to fill a humanitarian vacuum, a protection vacuum. This is what UNRWA fundamentally has been unable to step up for. It has done it, and then it has decreased. And this is also the reflex of several different management. There have been protection-oriented people in UNRWA leading toward more protection, and there have also been bureaucrats, that have completely shrunk the agency. And what Jørgen says is mind-blowing for me right now. I mean, I'm also very passionate about that because I've been in UNRWA. I've worked for the agency. I've written a lot. I've researched. I've digged into the archives. And so I know the history and the potential of this body, which under international law is a subsidiary body to the General Assembly. So in order to be dismantled and dismembered, as it's de facto happening, you should have a discussion within, not outside the General Assembly. You see the nonsense and the lack of compliance with international law. But also I would have expected, and this is the last thing I wanted to say, a strong response from the United Nations, because the UNRWA premises in East Jerusalem, are still there. Israel is not renewing visa to UN international staffers. Doesn't matter. Israel has no authority to issue visa. We should not comply with the diktat of an de facto occupier, but an unlawful occupier, because the occupation must go. This is what the International Court of Justice says. So the UN UNRWA offices in East Jerusalem should become the hub of the UN in East Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, instead of being abandoned to the settlers. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And one of the big questions many people have, just more generally looking at the region, is what are Arab countries doing? I mean, Jørgen, you have spent a lot of your research on studying the relationship between the US and the Middle East in particular. And Trump still hopes he can deliver on something that he was close to achieving before October 7th. That is the normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. During his first term, he had managed to normalize ties with 4 Arab and African nations under the so-called Abraham Accords. But Saudi Arabia has said it unequivocally rejects Trump's proposal of relocating Palestinians from Gaza and said it would continue its efforts to establish an independent Palestinian state. So, I mean, we are seeing Trump going way further than anyone could have ever imagined in his support to Israel. So what can we expect from US-Arab relations in the years to come?
I think one of the lasting legacies of the Trump administration, if we take a step back from the Middle East, I'll zoom into the Middle East, I promise. But if we take a step back from the Middle East and just globally, the US is really shredding its international legitimacy. Any trust in the US as a political body that other states, even its close allies, can trust is really being shredded now. Because, I mean, here in Europe, because of the time lag, we wake up every morning, we look at our phone and we think, what madness has he done last night? And this is happening to close allies. I mean, Canada, right? So if we go back to the Middle East, the US really has some Arab allies in the region. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. These are very important states for the US. But now the US is saying, okay, we're going to ethnically cleanse Gaza, and Egypt and Jordan have to take them in. If they don't take them in, we're going to cut aid. I mean, that's just running a bulldozer over the allies that they've built up over many, many decades. Saudi Arabia, the Palestinian issue is not their main concern, but there is kind of a point of too much pain for them. If there is too much going on against the Palestinians, there is no way Saudi Arabia can accept normalization. I always analyzed it as normalization was going to be extremely difficult anyway, because Saudi Arabia, basically by virtue of the other Gulf states having normalized, Saudi Arabia could more or less reap the benefits without paying the cost. Rumors had it that they were rather close, but after 7th of October, that pain threshold is too evident, because what's happening in Gaza, Saudi Arabia cannot stand behind that. So as long as that's going on, normalization is impossible. If we add the context of Trump basically saying to Netanyahu that, you can experiment with this however you want, and Netanyahu saying a Palestinian state can be in Saudi Arabia, really this is burning that bridge. So, the relation with the Arab states is unstable and weak at best, But we're really talking about a situation where Trump is pushing kind of the pain threshold.
As we wrap this episode, many of us who support an international system grounded in the rule of law and shared norms that nearly every nation had agreed to, but more than that, I think a lot of decent people who think everyone deserves to live dignified lives in their homes, many people are feeling dismayed, shocked, and really overwhelmed by just how utterly abandoned the Palestinians have been. It's difficult to process everything that has been happening and to know how to respond at an individual level as well. So I'd like to ask both of you, what can be done to help? How can we as a collective or as an individual mitigate the consequences of what is happening to the Palestinian people?
Well, first of all, your vote matters. I mean, at least many of us live in democracies. Your vote matters. The party you vote for matters, how they behave. But I think as states, I think it's really important in this moment that we don't just step around trying to not offend the US, but that we take very clear positions with regard to protecting the institutions that kind of describe those values that you outlined. I think Norway, our government, has gone much further than most Western states in this regard. And there's always points to be made on details, this and that. But in general, I'm very proud of how the Norwegian government has acted. I wish more European states would have kind of followed that path. But those are the two main things I can highlight.
Francesca?
This is where probably I am the most tired with, because Jørgen, is true what you say, and I have really, this is the only country where I come. I don't meet with the minister and foreign minister of foreign affairs because they are out of the country, in fact. And I know that had they been here, I would have had this meeting, and I'm still not nervous about that, because I have a very open, candid discussion with the government in this country, and I trust the government. It's true that they've done, I was here 2 years ago, and I was slightly disappointed with the lack of coherence and more action. 2 years later, I see that things have happened. However, there are three things that need to change. First of all, let me talk about, not necessarily in order of importance, but the government has stepped up, but still is not, the country is not fully in compliance with the international law obligation. The Norway is not. Like all member states are not in compliance with the ICJ advisory opinion, which has said uncontrovertibly that in the occupation that Israel maintains in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful, totally, unconditionally. It must be dismantled. The troops, the military soldiers, the barracks, whatever, the police offices in settlements, everything has to be taken out, all Israeli forces. And the military control over inside the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, must end. So including these different agreements, these different legal arrangements that Israel has over the three parts of the territory. Then the settlements must go. And then even the control over the natural resources of the Palestinians, including the access to the land, airspace, it's to end. And the responsibility of member states is not to recognize the legal consequences, any legal consequences of this illegal reality, and to try to use their leverage to bring it to the end, but most importantly, not to aid and abet in any possible ways the illegality of the occupation. The occupation wouldn't exist if it was not for the economic and financial support that it receives. And here we are in a country which, through its pension fund, its oil fund, which is state-owned, has the highest investment of the highest European investment in the occupation, which accounts for 10% of the European investments and the occupation. So you see the schizophrenia of all this. This needs to end. And this is where my second point, the Norwegian people, fantastic. I see so many engaged, and I hear here, like in any part of the world, people whining, yeah, but what can we do more? Or I'm tired, and people are getting the fatigue. And this is who we are as a humanity. I mean, the people in Palestine continue to be slaughtered, and we have the choice to stop fighting. I mean, this is where I'm saying I'm tired because I have a life, I have a family, and I cannot. And this is not even a job for me. I had to put my job aside for doing this, keeping on awaking consciences, or the conscience of those who are in power and those who have the power, because as Jørgen says, we live in a democracy. So people cannot stop asking accountability for the people in Gaza and for themselves. The third and last thing is this is not about the people in Palestine or in the region, because the Gaza crisis has exposed that we are part of a global crisis. European countries have, in Western countries in general, and others have cracked down on the freedom of expression and freedom of assembly of their own citizens. So nothing in this interconnected world, nothing is a phenomenon that lives in isolation. And what's happening today is a symptom of something bigger and very ugly that is taking over our human rights dominated world. So we should feel very concerned that what's happening there sooner or later will knock at our door as well.
Francesca, Jørgen, thank you very much. This episode was produced by Arnaud Siad and edited by Niels Johan Halvorsen, with music from Brage Pedersen. Find out more about PRIO's events, policy briefs, blog posts, and cutting-edge research on PRIO.org.